Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You ever been stabbed in the heart with a butter knife, right in front of the mashed potatoes, while your aunt pretends she didn't hear a thing and your dad just keeps shoveling green beans onto his plate like the world isn't ending? That was my Thanksgiving last year, and let me tell you, it wasn't even the worst part. See, growing up in the Miller family wasn't like some cozy Norman Rockwell painting where everybody smiles and passes the gravy around with a twinkle in their eye. No, growing up in my house was like surviving a slow, polite war where the only weapons were guilt, disappointment, and backhanded compliments disguised as love. I was never the favorite. That was Eric's title from the moment he popped out, screaming and already charming the nurses with his big blue eyes and curly blonde hair. If Eric even looked in the direction of a textbook, Mom was posting about it on Facebook like he had cured cancer. Me? I brought home straight as and a job offer from a law firm right out of college, and the best I ever got was a tired "that's nice, honey" before she asked Eric if he needed help picking out a new suit. Maybe it was because I didn't smile enough, or because I didn't want to get married and settle down in our same dusty little town where everyone judged you by who your parents were and how nice your lawn looked. So there we were, that Thanksgiving, sitting around the table like a live grenade had been placed between the turkey and the stuffing, and we were all just trying not to set it off. Grandma was there, chewing her peas slowly and pretending not to notice the tension thick enough to cut with a steak knife. Uncle Ron was already half drunk, telling a story for the fifth time about the time he almost met Joe Montana at a gas station in Nebraska. And Mom, oh Mom, was sitting there in her ironed Thanksgiving sweater, gripping her wine glass like it was a lifeline. The first shot across the bow came after I mentioned, casually, that I had been thinking about buying a little condo in the city. Nothing fancy. Just something I could call my own without having to constantly hear the neighbor's dog barking through the walls. It was supposed to be a simple, easy topic, a way to survive the meal without poking any bears. But Mom's eyes narrowed just a little, and before I could even finish the sentence, she was jumping in with that tight little smile she always saved for when she was about to say something awful. "Well, Lauren, maybe you should focus less on wasting money on some city shoebox," she said, her voice sweet enough to rot teeth, "and more on figuring out how you're going to help your brother with the house and business when the time comes." I blinked, fork halfway to my mouth, already sensing the trap, but not quick enough to avoid stepping right into it. "What do you mean, help him?" I asked stupidly, because deep down I already knew the answer and just hadn't been willing to admit it to myself yet. Mom set her wine glass down with a little clink, folded her hands like she was a damn priest about to deliver a sermon, and said, "Eric deserves that inheritance, not you. You're just, well, you're just a leech. You always have been." The silence that followed was so deep I swear I could hear Uncle Ron's liver giving up in the background. Even Grandma paused mid-chew, peas rolling off her fork and onto the floor. Eric shifted in his seat, looking embarrassed, but not embarrassed enough to say anything. That was the worst part, maybe. Not even the insult, but the fact that nobody, not even my own brother, had the guts to stand up and say, "That's not true." I felt my heart hammering in my chest, that old, familiar mix of rage and humiliation rising up like bile, but this time, instead of fighting back, something inside me just snapped. Not loudly. Not with fireworks or screams. Quietly. Cleanly. Like a string being cut. I set my fork down, wiped my mouth with my napkin as neatly as if I were at some high-end restaurant instead of sitting at a battlefield disguised as a dinner table, and smiled. Not a big smile. Not a real smile. Just enough of a smile to let her know she hadn't won. "Fine," I said, my voice calm and sweet, the way hers had been when she gutted me like a fish. "He can have it. Every damn piece." The table erupted into a babble of voices, Eric trying to protest weakly, Grandma whispering a prayer under her breath, Uncle Ron obliviously asking if there was any more cranberry sauce, but I just stood up, smoothed down my sweater, and walked out the door. I didn't take anything with me. Not my coat. Not my purse. Not even a to-go plate. Just my pride and a plan already starting to form in the back of my mind. Because if they wanted Eric to have it all, they were damn well going to get what they asked for. Every last bit. And God help them, because they didn't even know what they were asking for yet. People always talk about inheritances like they're some golden ticket, like they're this glittering pot of gold waiting at the end of a very long, very sad rainbow. But the truth is, sometimes an inheritance is just a time bomb with your name already scrawled across it in big, ugly letters. The family business that Mom kept going on about, the one she acted like was some multi-million-dollar empire Eric was going to heroically step up and manage, was, in reality, about 2 months away from collapsing like a cheap lawn chair under a heavy drunk uncle at a 4th of July barbecue. It was a tiny hardware store my granddad had started back in the 1960s, and back then it probably meant something to have your name painted on a dusty window and your own little bell over the door. But times changed, and by the time I was old enough to start understanding money, I realized the only thing grand about Granddad's hardware was the pile of debt it was sitting on, growing a little higher every year while my parents lied to themselves and everybody else about how they were just a few good months away from turning it all around. I knew every ugly secret about that place because guess who got stuck helping out when Mom and Dad were too tired or too broke to deal with it? That's right, me, Lauren the Leech, apparently good enough to scrub bathrooms and balance books, but not good enough to deserve any real piece of the empire. I had spent years quietly cleaning up their messes, paying late fees from my own pocket when Mom forgot, arguing with suppliers who hadn't seen a check in 6 months, smoothing over angry customers when shipments arrived busted or 3 weeks late. Meanwhile, Eric would breeze through town twice a year, buy everyone around at the bar, and get treated like he was the second coming of George Washington. And the house? Oh, the house was a whole different flavor of nightmare. It looked pretty enough from the outside, if you didn't know where to look too closely. A sweet, crumbling Victorian with peeling white paint and a sagging porch that whined every time you stepped on it like it was begging you to put it out of its misery. Inside, it was even worse. Cracked pipes that leaked brown water if you dared to turn on 2 taps at once, faulty wiring that made the lights flicker every time the fridge kicked on, and let's not even talk about the mold hiding behind the drywall because apparently fixing the roof after the hailstorm in 2015 had been too expensive. The city had already slapped a couple of fines on the property for structural neglect, and the back taxes had been quietly stacking up like bad karma. Honestly, the house alone had, like, $250,000 in repairs needed. Or maybe it was 215. Math isn't my thing. Either way, it was a nightmare waiting to happen, and Mom knew it. But she kept talking about the family home like it was some sacred relic we were all supposed to be fighting over instead of running away from as fast as our legs could carry us. So when she sat there at Thanksgiving, looking down her nose at me and handing Eric the keys to the crumbling kingdom with all the smug satisfaction of a queen bestowing land to her favorite knight, I didn't get mad. Not really. I got smart. Within 2 weeks, I had packed up every single thing I owned that mattered into one battered old suitcase. I went down to the county office and signed over every claim, every deed, every single ounce of responsibility to Eric. All the paperwork, all neat and tidy, no loopholes, no taybacks, no asterisks or hidden clauses. The business, the house, the land, the taxes, the debts, it was all his now, free and clear, gift-wrapped with a shiny red bow. I even paid for the filing fees myself, just to make sure nothing could gum up the works later. It cost me about $75, which I figured was a damn good deal for buying myself a front-row seat to the slow-motion car crash that was about to unfold. I didn't leave a note. I didn't leave a forwarding address. Hell, I didn't even leave my Netflix password behind. I just walked out the door with my suitcase and a smile, breathing in the cold November air like it was the first clean breath I had taken in 20 years. The beautiful thing about revenge, real, patient, cold-blooded revenge, is that sometimes you don't have to lift a finger after you set the pieces in motion. Sometimes, you just have to step back and let gravity do its cruel, inevitable work. I didn't need to sabotage anything, didn't need to yell or scream or make a dramatic scene on Facebook like some people would have. I just needed to let Eric do what Eric always did, assume the world owed him something, and wait for reality to slap him across the face. I moved into a tiny studio apartment 2 towns over, nothing fancy, just 4 walls, a working bathroom, and peace and quiet thick enough to wrap around me like a blanket. No family drama, no endless guilt trips, no stupid hardware store eating up every second of my life. Just me, a hot plate, a mattress on the floor, and the kind of silence you don't realize you've been craving until you finally hear it. I didn't even feel guilty, not really. Not at first, anyway. Maybe that makes me a terrible person. Maybe it makes me human. Maybe it makes me smarter than I ever gave myself credit for being. Either way, when I signed that last paper and slid it across the scratched county office desk, I knew something Mom never taught me, something Eric would have to learn the hard way. Sometimes, the best gifts are the ones you give with a smile and a stick of dynamite hidden inside the pretty wrapping paper. There is a certain kind of satisfaction you can only understand when you have spent your whole life being the punching bag and suddenly, quietly, you realize you are no longer in the ring at all, just leaning against the wall in the back of the room, watching the people who used to throw the punches start swinging at nothing but air and each other. I did not have to do a single thing after I handed Eric the whole rotten empire. Gravity took over, like I knew it would, and it took less than a month for the cracks to start showing, both in the house and in Eric's too-proud smile. At first, he tried to play the hero, which was so predictable it almost made me yawn. He slapped a coat of cheap white paint on the peeling siding, replaced a few rotten porch boards with whatever scrap wood he could scrounge from the back of the store, and posted pictures on Facebook with long captions about taking pride in the family legacy and building something real for the next generation. I even gave one of his posts a little heart react just to make sure he knew I was watching, but not close enough to get my shoes dirty. What he did not know, what he never thought to ask, was that the house's real problems were way deeper than a few creaky floorboards and some chipped paint. There had been a flood back in 2016, not some biblical wipeout, but enough to soak the foundation and leave a hairline fracture running straight through the basement wall. I had begged Mom and Dad to get it professionally assessed back then, but of course, money was tight and it'll be fine. Lauren, stop worrying so much, so they slapped some waterproof paint over the cracks and called it a day. Insurance never even heard a whisper about it because nobody wanted the rates to go up, and you better believe it never crossed Eric's mind to have a real inspection done before he started moving furniture into a house that was sinking by inches. Meanwhile, the hardware store, that sad little relic of better days, was bleeding out in full view of anyone with half a brain to look. The court summons started arriving first, thin envelopes with serious seals that Eric thought he could ignore because, in his mind, bills were just suggestions and deadlines were optional. Then came the IRS letters, big angry ones with red stamps and numbers that kept getting bigger every time he stuffed one in a drawer and pretended it did not exist. I heard about it all through the grapevine because, in a small town, secrets spread faster than the flu in a kindergarten class, and people love nothing more than to sip coffee over somebody else's slow downfall. Mom moved into the house about 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, dragging her queen-sized mattress, her collection of precious moments figurines, and her absolute conviction that Eric would turn it all around with nothing but elbow grease and a few prayers. It might have worked if prayers could fix foundation cracks or make court fees vanish into thin air, but last I checked, even miracles have limits, and the Miller family had long since spent their share of divine favors. The real comedy started when Eric decided he was going to flip the house, sell it for a fat profit, and use the money to revitalize the hardware store into some kind of boutique tool shop for hipster weekend warriors. He called it his 5-year plan, but honestly, it looked more like a 5-month freefall. First open house, the real estate agent nearly broke her ankle stepping through a soft spot in the kitchen floor, and when the first batch of prospective buyers tried to flush the upstairs toilet, the pipes groaned loud enough to set the neighbor's dog howling. Eric tried patching things himself, YouTube tutorials blaring from his phone while he hammered drywall in crooked, painted over mold spots with layers of cheap latex paint, and wrestled with electrical wiring that sparked every time he so much as breathed wrong. It was like watching a man trying to patch the Titanic with a roll of duct tape and a handful of soggy napkins, smiling all the while like the ship wasn't already halfway underwater. By January, the house had been pulled from every serious listing site, flagged as not up to code, and Mom had started sleeping with a flashlight by her bed in case the electrical system finally gave up and set the place on fire. Meanwhile, back at the hardware store, suppliers were pulling their accounts, customers were whispering about unpaid bills, and somebody, I'll never say who, but let's just say karma has a funny sense of humor, tipped off a local journalist about the beloved small-town business facing financial woes. When I saw the first article pop up online, complete with a picture of Eric looking sweaty and bewildered under the flickering Miller's hardware sign, I couldn't help but smile into my cup of gas station coffee. It wasn't even the big explosion yet, no. This was just the rumble before the real quake, but it was enough to know the ground was shifting under him, faster than he could scramble to patch the cracks. Because cracks, once they start, don't stop spreading just because you pretend not to see them. They grow, they widen, they pull apart everything you thought was solid until there's nothing left but rubble and regret. Eric was standing on a crumbling stage, the whole town slowly pulling up chairs to watch the show, and the best part was he had handed out the invitations himself, smiling like a damn fool all the while. And I was just getting comfortable in my front row seat. There is a point in every slow-motion disaster where even the most clueless participant starts to realize they are not going to walk away unscathed, no matter how fast they run or how many pretty words they throw at the problem. And for Eric, that moment finally arrived sometime in late February, just after the third failed attempt to sell the house that he used to call our family's proud legacy on his Facebook page. I heard about it first from a girl I used to work with back in high school, the kind of woman who still somehow knew every little scandal in town without ever setting foot outside her own front porch, and she told me, laughing so hard she could barely get the words out, that Eric's name had been plastered all over the county legal notices like a kid who flunked out of school and had to wear a sandwich board reading "I screwed up" down Main Street. Turns out, once the suppliers started suing for unpaid invoices, the hardware store's so-called assets became fair game for anyone with a lawyer and a grudge. And because the store and the house were tied together in the same half-assed trust Mom had cobbled together years ago to save on taxes, the lawsuits froze the title of the house too, slapping it with enough liens and legal warnings to scare off even the most desperate bargain hunter. Eric, of course, did what he always did when real life came knocking with a baseball bat. He panicked, he postured, he blamed everyone but himself, and then he panicked some more when nothing magically fixed itself. I heard he tried to sweet-talk one of the local real estate agents into listing the house under the table, but she took one look at the paperwork nightmare tangled around the property and politely suggested he try Craigslist instead. Or maybe just light it on fire and collect the insurance, although knowing our luck the damn thing would refuse to burn and just stand there in defiance, ugly and broken and still owing back taxes. Speaking of taxes, the IRS letters had gone from politely firm to outright threatening by that point, and Eric had finally, belatedly, figured out that filing for bankruptcy was probably his only real move left on the chessboard. Except even that was not going to be simple because, surprise, surprise, when you lie on your bankruptcy paperwork or conveniently forget to mention certain debts, people tend to notice. While all this was unraveling, Mom's health had started to slip in a way even she could not ignore anymore, her voice losing its sharpness, her hands shaking more and more when she tried to stir her endless cups of tea, and though I told myself I was done with them, that I had cut the cord and walked away clean, some nights I still found myself staring at my cheap ceiling tiles, wondering if I should at least call, if only to hear for myself how bad things had gotten. But pride is a hell of a drug, and I figured if they needed me so badly, they knew damn well where to find me. After all, I had been the one fixing their messes for most of my life. And nobody had thought twice about throwing me out with the kitchen scraps when it suited them. The real kicker came one gray Saturday afternoon when I was sitting in my little studio apartment, drinking the worst cup of instant coffee ever brewed and half watching the local news out of sheer boredom, and suddenly, there he was, Eric. My golden brother, live on TV, sitting in front of the cracked, peeling facade of the hardware store like a man on trial for crimes he did not even fully understand. His hair was a mess, his face pale and sweaty under the too harsh studio lights, and his voice cracked halfway through his stumbling explanation about unexpected financial hardships and family obligations and a series of unfortunate events that, judging by the reporter's skeptical eyebrows, nobody was buying for a damn second. At one point, when the reporter pressed him about the lawsuits and the IRS investigation and the fact that the store's last 2 employees had walked out 3 weeks earlier without even bothering to give notice, Eric's face crumpled, right there on live television. And he actually started to cry, great heaving sobs that made the microphone squeal and the cameraman awkwardly zoom out like he was trying to give the poor guy some space to drown in his own failure. I watched the whole thing from start to finish, sipping my bitter coffee and feeling not glee, not exactly, but a kind of grim, hollow satisfaction, like watching the final piece of a long, ugly puzzle snap into place. For a moment, just a brief flicker in the back of my mind, I felt a stab of guilt so sharp and sudden it made me set my cup down a little too hard on the chipped kitchen counter. After all, he was my brother, and Mom, for all her cruelty, had still tucked me in at night when I was little, still bandaged my knees when I fell off my bike, still cried at my high school graduation even if she spent the after-party bragging about Eric instead. Maybe I had gone too far. Maybe handing them the loaded gun and walking away had been just as cruel as pulling the trigger myself. But then I thought about all the years I spent swallowing my pride, patching their holes, sacrificing my dreams while they smiled and nodded and handed Eric the world on a silver platter, and I realized that maybe, just maybe, they had dug their own graves long before I ever decided to stop filling in the holes for them. I stared at the TV as Eric wiped his face on the sleeve of his cheap suit, tried to muster a smile for the camera, and failed miserably. Outside, the wind howled against the window like a ghost wailing at the edge of the world, and I leaned back in my chair, feeling, for the first time in a long time, almost weightless. Maybe I had gone too far. Or maybe I had finally stopped going anywhere for people who would never, not in a million years, have done the same for me. There is a strange, almost guilty sweetness to living a life nobody is tracking, to waking up in the morning and realizing you owe nothing to anyone except maybe the scraggly houseplants in the corner begging for water. And that was the feeling that settled over me once the dust had finally cleared, once the smoke from the wreckage of my family's so-called legacy stopped stinging my eyes. I had not set out to be free, not really, not in the beginning when I stood up from that Thanksgiving table and let the door slam behind me, but somewhere between then and now, between the late nights alone and the endless cups of gas station coffee, I found something I had never been allowed to have growing up, peace, plain and unremarkable and perfect in its own stubborn way. I got a job that paid just enough to keep my lights on and my little fridge stocked with frozen dinners and bottles of cheap red wine. A job that did not demand my soul in exchange for a paycheck or make me sit through endless meetings pretending to care about who was climbing the invisible corporate ladder the fastest. I worked the early shift at a dusty secondhand bookstore 2 blocks from my apartment, the kind of place that smelled like yellowed pages and forgotten dreams. And nobody cared if my hair was a mess or if my shoes didn't match because the customers were mostly tired people looking for something to distract them from their own lives for a few hours. Some nights, when the air got warm enough, I would walk down to the little hole-in-the-wall diner on the corner, order the same greasy burger and limp fries, and sit by the window with a book, pretending I was a character in someone else's story. Someone who had gotten out before things got too messy. I took little trips when I could, nothing grand or Instagram-worthy, just day drives to the coast or cheap motels with scratchy sheets and vending machines that ate your quarters without apology. But every time I stood on some empty beach or watched the sun set over a parking lot filled with pickup trucks, I thought, this is mine, all of it, even the ugly parts. I even started dating again, tentatively, like someone testing the ice over a frozen lake, half expecting it to crack and dump me into freezing water at any second. Most of the guys were nothing to write home about, one too obsessed with his fantasy football league, another who still lived with his mother to save money, a third who told me he loved me on the second date and cried when I didn't say it back. But it did not matter because, for once, I was not dating to fix anyone, to heal anyone, or to prove anything to people who never cared if I was happy in the first place. Every so often, though, the past would creep back in around the edges of my mind, like smoke slipping under a door you thought was shut tight. I would see a woman in the grocery store who looked just a little too much like Mom, if I squinted, or hear a guy at the gas station arguing with someone on the phone in that same tight, exasperated voice Eric used when things slipped out of his control. Those moments never lasted long, but they were enough to remind me that the past does not disappear just because you walk away from it. It follows you, sits beside you on the bus, watches you from across the diner, tucks itself into the corners of your dreams. It was on one of those restless nights, sitting at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. with a cup of bitter coffee going cold in my hands, that I remembered something I had almost forgotten: the folder. The thin manila folder I had left on the kitchen counter the night I packed my suitcase and walked out, the folder filled with all the dirty little secrets about the house, the business, the debts, complete with highlighted notes and bright sticky tabs marked urgent and read immediately. I had left it there in plain sight, not hidden, not buried, just sitting there like a landmine waiting to be triggered by anyone with enough curiosity to flip it open and read. Eric had not read it. Of course he hadn't. Maybe he was too busy celebrating, too busy planning how he was going to turn my parents' slow-motion disaster into his personal empire, too busy believing what he always had, that the world would hand him whatever he wanted if he just smiled wide enough and shook enough hands. In the end, it had all been right there in front of him, all the warnings, all the red flags, all the detailed instructions on how to avoid the avalanche I knew was coming. He could have called the numbers I left scribbled in the margins, could have met with the tax attorney I had set up an appointment with under his name, could have saved himself months of humiliation, bankruptcy, and tears on local television. He had everything he needed to survive. He just never bothered to look. Maybe I am a villain in someone else's story. Hell, maybe I am the villain in my own story. The shadow at the edge of every cheerful memory, the bad seed they whisper about after the lights go out. Maybe I went too far, maybe I should have done more, should have saved them from themselves one more time, even if it broke me into 1,000 more pieces. But here is the thing nobody ever tells you about survival. Sometimes it looks a lot like betrayal to the people who expected you to drown quietly to keep them afloat. I finished my coffee, cold and bitter and perfect, and leaned back in my chair, listening to the steady hum of the city outside my window, a lullaby of sirens and late-night laughter and the low, rumbling promises of a life still unwritten. Maybe I am a villain. Maybe I am a survivor. Either way, I sleep like a damn baby.